The silence in the great hall was absolute, a heavy, airless thing that pressed the breath from the lungs of every warrior present. 200 high-ranking wolves remained frozen, their foreheads pressed against the cold stone, terrified to even twitch. They had expected the king's wrath, perhaps a roar that would shake the rafters, but Tharion Velkross did something far more soul-shattering. He moved. The heavy, rhythmic click of his boots against the wet floor was the only sound, cutting through the stillness like a blade. He didn't stop at the high throne. He didn't acknowledge Elyra's trembling form. Instead, the Alpha King, the man who had spent a decade turning battlefields into graveyards, slowly lowered himself. The pack let out a collective, silent gasp as their king knelt on the dirty, soap-slicked floor. He ignored the grime ruining his royal furs to meet the eyeline of the girl who was supposed to be nothing. Elyra's breath hitched, her fingers still clutching the rough bristles of her brush. For the first time, she saw the gold in his eyes, not the gold of a crown, but the gold of a fire that recognized its own heat. "They aren't bowing to me, Elyra," Tharion whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to wake the very shadows at her feet. "They are bowing because the monster in me recognizes the goddess in you, and it has finally met its master. Welcome to Bound to the Alpha. What you're about to witness isn't just a story, it's a moment that changes everything. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the truth behind why she was the one they feared is not what you think. And if you stop halfway, you'll miss the twist that flips the entire story upside down, and if this pulls you in even a little, go ahead and like, and share it with someone who needs a story like this today." Before we begin, drop your territory in the comments. I want to see where you're watching from. Now, let's step into the hall where the entire pack bowed, and one girl changed everything. Before the king walked in, before the air turned to ice, there was only the blue, unforgiving light of the servants' quarters and the endless, bone-deep ache of the Ghostborn. Elyra Vosselin didn't just work, she existed in the margins of the pack's life, a living omen of bad luck that the others used to sharpen their cruelty. Elyra and Rudrick Vaylor took a twisted pleasure in the weight of her burden. To them, she was a convenient receptacle for their arrogance. Just an hour before the hall went silent, Rudrick had intentionally overturned a flagon of fermented ale, watching with a smirk as the dark liquid soaked into Elyra's fraying sleeves. "Scrub it until the stone bleeds, Ghostborn," he had hissed, his heavy boot pinning her fingers to the floor just long enough to feel the crunch of bone. Elyra had laughed, the sound echoing off the cold damp walls. They treated her as a thing without a soul, a shadow that performed their labor. They had no idea that every insult they hurled was being absorbed into a darkness deeper than the night, a power that was quietly waiting for the right king to call it home. The temperature in the great hall didn't just drop, it died. One moment, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the arrogant heat of 200 predatory bodies. The next, a vacuum of sound swallowed the room. The iron-bound doors didn't creak, they groaned under the weight of a presence that felt like a mountain moving. Tharion Velkross stood in the entrance, a silhouette of jagged armor and midnight fur against the dying sunset. As he stepped forward, the environmental shift was violent. The massive central fire pit, which had been roaring seconds ago, suddenly recoiled. The flames turned a pale, shivering blue before shrinking into the ash, as if the fire itself feared to cast a shadow in the king's direction. Elyra, mid-taunt, felt his knees buckle as if the gravity in the room had suddenly tripled. Beside him, Rudrick and the other high-ranking warriors collapsed. It wasn't a respectful bow, it was a desperate, instinctive retreat from a predator that occupied every inch of the atmosphere. Spines curved, foreheads struck the stone, and the only sound that remained was the terrifying, rhythmic click of Tharion's boots against the wet floor. The king didn't look at the lords who had ruled in his absence. His eyes, dark as a sunless sea, were fixed on the only anomaly in the room, a girl with reddened hands and a scrub brush, the only soul who hadn't yet realized that the world had just come to a standstill. Tharion did not offer a hand to help Elyra up. Instead, he remained in that impossible kneel, his presence a dark anchor in the center of the hall. The silence was so thin it felt as though the slightest breath would shatter it like glass. Maelor Draenic, still pinned to the stone by the sheer weight of the atmosphere, tried to shift his weight, his knee popping audibly in the quiet. Tharion's head didn't turn, but his voice sliced through the air. "Did I give you leave to move, Maelor?" The warrior froze, his face pale against the floor. "No, my king. It is just the pressure. Your power, it is heavy." Tharion let out a low, dangerous sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "My power?" He leaned closer to Elyra, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent, a mixture of lye, sweat, and something ancient that smelled like a thunderstorm before the first strike of lightning. "Look at them, Elyra. Look at how they tremble." Elyra finally lifted her gaze, her wide, honey-colored eyes darting to the rows of terrified men. For the first time, she saw it. They weren't looking at Tharion's shadow. They were staring at the floor around her feet, their eyes dilated with a primal, evolutionary dread. "They aren't shaking because of my crown," Tharion whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "They are shaking because they can finally smell what you've been scrubbing away. They aren't bowing to their king. They are bowing to their end." The transition from the damp, drafty cell of the Ghostborn to the king's private wing was a silent, surreal journey through a world Elyra had only ever seen while scrubbing its baseboards. Tharion did not delegate her care to the handmaids, he walked beside her, his shadow swallowing hers as they passed through corridors lined with tapestries that depicted ancient, forgotten wars. When the double doors of the royal chambers swung open, the air changed. It was no longer thin and biting, but thick with the scent of cedar, expensive parchment, and the lingering, warm musk of the king. The floor here was covered in plush, dark furs, so soft that Elyra instinctively curled her toes, hesitating to step forward. Her first instinct was to look for a bucket. Her hands, still stained with the grey lye of the great hall, felt like filth against the pristine silk sheets of the massive, carved bed. Tharion watched her from the hearth, the firelight catching the predatory stillness in his frame. Elyra stood in the center of the room, her shoulders hunched, waiting for the punchline, for Maelor to burst in and reveal this was all a cruel game. She reached out to touch a silver basin, but pulled back as if burned. In this room of golden velvet, she was a jagged piece of glass in a velvet box. She wasn't a guest, she was a storm being kept in a cage of luxury, and the silence of the room felt more deafening than the warrior's sneers. Habit is a difficult ghost to exorcise. Despite the plush surroundings, Elyra found herself standing before a floor-to-ceiling mirror of polished obsidian, a silk cloth in her hand. She began to wipe away a smudge of dust, her movements mechanical and small. But as she moved the cloth, the world within the glass fractured. Her reflection did not follow. Elyra froze, but the girl in the mirror kept moving. The reflected version of Elyra stood tall, her eyes bleeding into pools of absolute, ink-black darkness. The reflection reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass from the other side, and where the fingertips touched, the silver backing of the mirror began to smoke and dissolve into shadow. "Do not look away," Tharion's voice vibrated from the doorway. He didn't approach, as if giving her space to witness her own awakening. "You were told you were Ghostborn because the pack feared the void they felt within you. They called it a curse to keep you small." Elyra's heart hammered against her ribs as the shadow self in the glass tilted its head, a terrifyingly beautiful smile spreading across its face. The legend of the Void Luna isn't a ghost story, Elyra, Tharion whispered, his gaze locked on the darkening glass. It is the history of the only force capable of balancing an Alpha King. You aren't a servant of the light. You are the mistress of the dark they all tried to bury. The following afternoon, the king's business took him to the southern ramparts, leaving the royal wing unguarded for a single, fleeting hour. Elyra stepped into the corridor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't get far. A heavy shadow detached itself from the stone archway. Elyra stood there, his face a twisted mask of bruised pride and suppressed rage. He didn't bow. Instead, he crowded into her space, his scent of stale ale and aggression clashing with the clean cedar of the king's halls. The king isn't here to play protector, Ghostborn, Elyra hissed, his hand shooting out to grip her shoulder with bruising force. I don't care what fairy tales he tells you. You are a servant. You belong on the floor. He shoved her downward, his strength designed to break her spirit along with her stance. Get down. But as Elyra's knees moved toward the stone, the environment revolted. The torches lining the wall didn't just flicker, they died instantly, plunged into an impossible, ink-black darkness. From the corners of the ceiling, the shadows curdled and dropped like liquid obsidian. Before Elyra could even gasp, the darkness coiled around his throat and ankles like barbed wire. The floor beneath him seemed to liquefy, dragging his heavy boots into a depthless abyss. The warrior let out a choked scream as the very air began to freeze, not from ice, but from the terrifying, hungry void that had risen to defend its mistress. The shadows had barely retreated into the stones when the true trap was sprung. Elyra, his face purple and veins bulging from the void's cold grip, reached into his tunic with a trembling hand. He didn't pull a blade, he pulled a chain of ancient, blackened silver, etched with runes that hummed with a sick, parasitic light. As Tharion rounded the corner, sensing the disturbance, Elyra hurled the relic. The silver didn't strike the king's flesh, but it didn't need to. The moment the metal hit the air, it acted like a lightning rod for the Alpha's power. Tharion let out a guttural roar, falling to one knee as the silver veins of the relic pulsed, physically draining the golden light from his eyes. The ancient wolfbane silver was designed for one purpose, to hollow out a king until nothing but a man remained. You chose a curse over your own kind, Elyra hissed, finding his feet as the shadows protecting Elyra withered under the relic's oppressive radiance. Without Tharion's anchoring presence, the darkness was nothing more than smoke. Elyra drew a jagged obsidian dagger, his eyes fixed on Elyra. The king is neutralized, and the Ghostborn ends tonight. Tharion struggled against the invisible weight, his muscles seizing, his wolf screaming behind a cage of silver light. He looked at Elyra, not with fear for himself, but with a silent, desperate command. The trap was set, the king was falling, and the only thing left to stand between the Pax blade and the void was a girl who had only just stopped scrubbing the floors. Elyra's obsidian blade descended, a streak of hungry black light aimed at Elyra's throat. But the blade never found its mark. Time seemed to liquefy as Elyra stopped fighting the tide rising within her chest. She stopped trying to be small. She stopped trying to be the girl who scrubbed the floors and finally became the woman who owned the shadows beneath them. A scream tore from her throat, but it wasn't a sound of fear, it was a roar of liberation. From her outstretched palms, an explosion of pure, sentient void erupted. It didn't just fill the corridor, it flooded the entire great hall like an ink-slicked tsunami. The torches didn't just go out, they were consumed, their light eaten by a darkness so absolute it felt like velvet. Elyra was thrown backward, his body pinned against the stone by invisible, crushing hands of shadow. The ancient silver relic in his grasp shattered, its parasitic light snuffed out by the sheer volume of Elyra's power. Throughout the hall, the rebel warriors who had dared to stand were brought to their knees, not by the king's authority, but by the weight of a void Luna who had finally stopped hiding. The floor didn't just run with water or wine anymore, it ran with darkness. In the center of the abyss stood Elyra, her hair whipping in a wind that came from nowhere, her eyes glowing with a terrifying, hollow light. She wasn't scrubbing the grime away anymore. She was the storm that was going to wash the pack clean. The darkness did not retreat, it simply settled, becoming a permanent part of the great hall's architecture. As the ink-black mist finally thinned, it revealed a transformation that would be etched into the pack's history forever. Maillard Draynick remained pinned to the stone, his eyes wide and vacant, his spirit broken by the sheer magnitude of the power that had judged him. Around him, the warriors who had once spat on the Ghostborn now remained in a bow of genuine, visceral terror, unable to lift their gazes even as the physical weight of the void lifted. Elyra stood in the center of the hall, her breath steady, her hands no longer reddened by lie but glowing with a soft, ethereal silver. Tharion approached her, his own golden eyes reflecting her shadow. He did not reclaim the throne, he stood beside her, his hand sliding into hers as an equal. He looked out at the trembling assembly, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence and a new beginning. "You once called her a curse," he declared, the sound echoing off the rafters. "Now, you will call her Luna. And you will remember that while I rule the pack, she rules the night that keeps you safe." Elyra looked down at the spot where she had been scrubbing just hours before. The wine stain was gone, replaced by a crystalline frost that would never melt. She was no longer the girl meant to be invisible. She was the anchor of the Ironmere territories, the woman whose name would be whispered in the dark to keep the bold humble. The cycle of cruelty was over, and in its place was a throne shared by fire and shadow. And just like that, the truth is finally revealed. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, I truly appreciate you for staying with me. Not everyone does, and that makes you part of something special. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join the pack, so you never miss the next powerful story. Drop your thoughts, theories, or your favorite moment in the comments. I read them all, and your voice matters here. And if this story spoke to you, go ahead and like and share it with someone who needs to experience it too. Until the next story, stay strong, stay curious, and remember, not everything is as it seems.